Greetings, ladies and gentlemen. This is Gennady Stolyarov II, and today I would like to devote a considerable amount of time to responding to Mr. Stefan Molyneux's critique of Dr. Ron Paul's campaign for U.S. President. This critique was made in the form of a video called Walter Block versus Stefan Molyneux versus Ron Paul. And in particular, the video was a reply to an article by Dr. Walter Block, a libertarian economist, that characterized in quite disparaging terms those libertarians who do not support Ron Paul's campaign or are somehow critical or skeptical of Ron Paul's positions. And to be fair, if I were judging this exchange as if it were a debate and I were serving the role of an impartial third-party judge, I would vote for Mr. Molyneux. I think his arguments, in terms of their quality as well as their presentation, were superior to those of Dr. Block. And I also think that Dr. Block made numerous tactical errors in how he presented his views. First of all, he did not listen to all of Mr. Molyneux's arguments. He only listened to the first 10 minutes of them, and then it seemed that he wrote an article based on his own notions about what Mr. Molyneux and other libertarians who do not support Ron Paul must be thinking. And this is never a sound approach. It is one of psychologizing rather than rational argumentation. Mr. Molyneux, in response, thoroughly demonstrated point by point how he does not fit Dr. Block's stereotype. And furthermore, Mr. Molyneux's arguments were civil and they were oriented toward ideas, not toward personal attacks. And to his credit, he also noted that he encourages people who find errors in his reasoning to try and correct him, and he indicated that he would be open to changing his position if such errors were demonstrated. I have great respect for Mr. Molyneux. He is a tremendously effective libertarian philosopher who has many millions of downloads and views to his credit. He has done a lot in advancing the education of liberty in a private, consensual venue. I definitely think he's a man of principle. He is a man who tries to live out his principles, and there are many areas in which I agree with him. I, like him, am an atheist and a libertarian, however, one who strongly supports Dr. Paul's campaign for president, and I think the setting for this discussion is our disagreement on the Ron Paul campaign. But nonetheless, this disagreement should not be cause to overlook the many areas of common ground that we have, and I think will continue to have, irrespective of how this turns out. My general intellectual approach is to eschew psychologizing altogether and focus on arguments at their face value. Thus, my aim here is to address Mr. Molyneux's arguments on their own terms, in the spirit of civil and respectful discussion, and in a manner that embraces the pursuit of truth and the improvement of the human condition above all. If Mr. Molyneux is interested in offering a response to my discussion here, I would welcome it greatly, and I would likewise invite him to attempt to correct any errors that he perceives in my analysis. As he has stated of himself, I am always open to intellectual growth, and if I am wrong in any area of my thinking and I can be shown convincingly to be wrong, then I'm open to changing that. But for now, let's begin by analyzing Mr. Molyneux's arguments point by point. He says, I don't know how it's strange when someone is philosophically against the initiation of force for me to be against the Constitution. And this is referring to a contrast between Mr. Molyneux's views and Dr. Paul's strict constitutionalism and insistence that the federal government strictly adhere to the Constitution. I respond that the Constitution may not be perfect, and indeed I will be one of the first to point out its flaws, such as the Interstate Commerce Clause and the General Welfare Clause, which should never have been in there, and by being in there enabled an unprecedented and unforeseen by the founders growth in the scope and power of the U.S. federal government. However, strict adherence to the Constitution, even with all of its flaws, is much, much better than what we have today. Thus, It is a directional improvement. I am a consequentialist, not a perfectionist, so I favor even imperfect but unambiguous directional improvements. To me, being against the Constitution, in the sense of refusing to support a candidate who is genuinely for the Constitution, is a case of counterproductively making the best the enemy of the good. Mr. Molyneux continues by saying that there is a difference between putting principled arguments for liberty in front of people and trying to gain control of a criminal organization to turn it toward virtue. Education and politics, he says, are two separate things. I respond that sometimes a political campaign is the most effective way of educating people who would not have been exposed to the ideas of liberty in the context of academic or other discussion. Think about all of the publicity that this campaign has generated for Ron Paul. Certainly not the same kind of publicity that would be generated for your typical Austrian economist, for all the good intentions and excellent analysis that your typical Austrian economist would provide. A political campaign places the ideas of liberty, and their articulator, Ron Paul in this case, in a much more prominent public spotlight. Education can occur through many channels, and there's no reason to disparage one particular channel that has shown astounding results. Furthermore, Ron Paul has not himself initiated any manner of criminal force, and he is not planning to. Indeed, if elected, he would try his best to undo the morally illegitimate force initiated in so many areas by the US federal government. Were that not his intention, libertarians would not be interested in his campaign, and it is precisely with that hope that we support him. Mr. Molyneux argues that if we have the power to turn evil institutions to virtue, let's test this power by turning it toward smaller organizations. Let's join the local mafia and turn it into the United Way. Well, while I admit this argument has some rhetorical power to it, I think Mr. Molyneux falsely assumes the moral equivalence of the local mafia and governments. This, of course, highlights a difference between his anarchist position and my minarchist, though quite unconventionally minarchist one, in that I see that government is not per se a criminal entity. While it is certainly possible for governments to engage in criminal actions, and many governments throughout history have done so, and many governments continue to do so today, governments are not criminal per se. They have a legitimate role in protecting the natural rights of their constituents, the rights to life, liberty, property, and the pursuit of happiness. However, it's not my intent here to turn this into a debate between minarchists and anarcho-capitalists. There have been plenty of those, and I do not think that this particular video is going to break new ground in those debates. If you are interested in my own position and the reasoning behind it, I encourage you to see my essay, Why I Do Not Adhere to Anarcho-Capitalism. However, I will point out that I am trying to reach out to anarcho-capitalists with this video. I do think that a principled anarcho-capitalist can support Ron Paul. I think that both minarchist and anarcho-capitalist persuasions are fundamentally compatible with supporting a Ron Paul campaign, as Ron Paul would bring the federal government closer to a real-world condition that is much more desirable for both minarchists and anarcho-capitalists. Whatever we want as the end goal, we can agree, I hope, that the status quo is far from it. So why not move in the right direction and worry about differences in that end goal once we have attained all that we do agree on, and the discussion about whether to have a night watchman federal government or no federal government at all becomes at all relevant to real-world policymaking. Right now, that discussion is as far away from the real world as one of two medieval peasants living in hovels talking about whether the Burj Dubai is a superior skyscraper to the Petronas Towers, when both of them would take centuries to even begin being built. There's furthermore a difference in temperament between mafia and government entities that need to be taken into account. A candidate who gets elected to a government office is much more likely to be able to make a persuasive argument and enact better policies through established channels then a person who joins the local mafia is likely to make a positive impression on the mafia boss before getting shot. Think about this. If Ron Paul joined the local mafia and started to make a speech before the local mafia boss, trying to convince him to stop attacking people and intimidating people and monopolizing local trade in certain commodities, do you think Ron Paul would be able to get to the end of that speech and remain alive? I somehow doubt it. But he has had tremendous success in Congress with principled speeches just of that sort. Practical details and differences in the actual effectiveness of one's actions matter a great deal when we are talking about how to achieve real change in the real world. So the structure of the organization, the temperament of the organization, is just as important, if not more so, than how you would characterize that organization philosophically as legitimate or illegitimate. Mr. Molyneux continues with an example that tries to abstract the matter away from what he considers a criminal organization. He asks, well, what about trying to turn a local pro-Hispanic group into an anti-Hispanic group? Of course, I don't think sensible people would ever want to do such a thing, but his general point is that an organization that's inclined in a certain way cannot be made practically to incline differently by an outsider who joins it or even rises to a leadership role in it. But I say this depends on the power of persuasion. If enough minds are changed, then certainly the organization's demeanor and its orientation can change as well. There's also the matter of prudent maneuvering on the part of the individual who attempts to enact the change. This latter aspect is based almost exclusively on the particular context of the situation, and some people know how to be prudent better than others. I certainly cannot comment on the particular context of turning around a given organization. It really, really depends on what Hayek called the circumstances of time and place. But I do think that Ron Paul is that rare individual who combines the characteristics of principle and prudence in a similar way that he combines the characteristics of outspoken intellectual firmness and impeccable civility. Mr. Molyneux continues along this line. I put this case out many years ago with respect to turning around the mafia organization, and I don't believe that anyone has actually tried it. I would agree. I also do not know of anyone trying this, but the reason for that, I think, is that this approach is not a valid empirical test. Common sense would suggest that the physical danger of infiltrating a local mafia group far exceeds the physical danger of running for political office. We libertarians want a freer society, but not at the risk of our lives. We want our freedom for something, to achieve the values that we hold most important. For me, the foremost value is my own life, but there are also many other values that I could not achieve if I were not alive, so I'm not going to risk it. A better empirical test, and one that has already been performed, is the tremendous success that Richard Cobden and John Bright had in bringing about the repeal of the British Corn Laws in the 1840s. And for an in-depth analysis of that, please see my paper, Lessons from Successful Free Trade Activism, The Arguments and Methods of Richard Cobden's Anti-Corn Law League. This is an extensive paper where I thoroughly analyze how Cobden and Bright were able to effect political change, unambiguous political change for the better, that essentially set off the dramatic growth in living standards throughout the world during the latter half of the 19th century. Cobden's movement was an excellent, excellent example of how it is indeed possible to work within the political system, to achieve massive liberalization, and even turn established politicians and business interests toward the cause of liberty. Essentially, as a result of that movement, Sir Robert Peel, the Prime Minister of Great Britain at the time, turned from an opponent of free trade and an advocate of the Corn Laws to someone who essentially sacrificed his political career to achieve their repeal. It is really a tremendously, tremendously effective thing that Cobden and Bright did. And having studied that case in great depth, I am 100% certain that political action can be effective in the right circumstances. Mr. Molyneux continues by saying that he is opposed to political action as a way of solving problems, including as a way of stopping the spread of tyranny throughout the world. So I want to ask him this. How can you get rid of political tyranny without somehow changing the political system? How can you change the political system without having some pro-liberty individuals take political action? I agree that there are many excellent non-political ways to educate individuals in liberty, reason, and philosophy, and to his credit, Mr. Molyneux has done an excellent job in that area. I will not understate my respect for him, and I will certainly not denigrate any of the work that he has been doing, because I think it's tremendously enlightening, and it certainly has been for me. However, let us say that he becomes wildly successful with his educational efforts, and he convinces the majority of the world to value liberty. However, let us also assume that he convinces the majority of the world to cleave to his no political action principle. Where does that leave our political system? If all the sensible, reasonable, pro-liberty listeners of Mr. Molyneux abstain from voting, campaigning, debating, and advocating, why, we will just be left with the political status quo, since just about the only ones still participating in the political system will be the ones who do not agree with Mr. Molyneux or the principles of liberty. So their vote will continue to be close to the entirety of the vote, even if that's a diminished pool of people now, and they will continue to elect their preferred candidates, who in turn will continue to perpetrate oppressive liberty-depriving policies. It is true that some change can occur outside the framework of the existing system, but ultimately, at some point, some friends of liberty have to participate in the existing system in order to reform it and turn it toward liberty. And I understand that doesn't have to be everyone. It might not even have to be the majority who actually take the political steps toward reform. But the way our electoral system works today, the majority of libertarians can help tremendously just by casting their votes or engaging people in discussion about the relative merits of some candidates as opposed to others, especially if we have someone as principled as Ron Paul running this time around. Mr. Molyneux argues that the entire challenge of economics and philosophy is the seen versus the unseen, of course echoing the great arguments in that respect made by Frédéric Bastiat. In this case, Mr. Molyneux posits that the seen is all the people who have been persuaded by Ron Paul to explore and adopt libertarian ideas. The unseen, he says, is all the people who have been turned off from libertarianism by Ron Paul. To this I reply that, granted, secondary consequences to action do exist, but in order to validly identify and assess a secondary consequence, one does need evidence for it, either empirical evidence or logical deductive evidence. And I ask, what evidence is there that a secondary consequence of Ron Paul's activism is that more people are turned off from libertarianism than are drawn toward it? Mr. Molyneux has not yet presented such evidence. If he has such evidence, I eagerly await it. I will inspect it, analyze it to the best of my ability, and comment on its merits if he should bring it up to me. He continues that Ron Paul has philosophical inconsistencies. Mr. Molyneux says Ron Paul is a fundamentalist Christian, while he, Mr. Molyneux, is a strong atheist, like me, actually. And Mr. Molyneux says that to him it would lack integrity at a fundamental level to say, well, this guy advances a particular cause that I like, namely the education of Austrian economics and the general population, and therefore I'm going to overlook this religious fundamentalism. I would say this is my biggest disagreement with Mr. Molyneux here. He falls into the dangerous trap of philosophical totalism, which is a vulnerability of every system that attempts to grasp the entirety of the world and the entirety of human affairs under a single overarching set of principles, whereby everything is related to everything else. This approach of applying overarching principles, I think, by itself is highly commendable. It can be tremendously effective and life-enhancing, but only if one is very, very careful to avoid its pitfalls. Philosophical totalism is that pitfall. It is the insistence that others must completely agree with every premise in one's worldview in order for one's actions or even association with that person to be beneficial at all. And I hope to delve into this flawed tendency in Mr. Molyneux's arguments a little later as well. The fact is, nobody is going to agree with anybody else on absolutely everything, or even on absolutely everything of philosophical significance. It can't happen. Human beings are too diverse. It is remarkable enough to find some fundamental common ground in some area of life with another person. This is the real world. And the reality is that we deal every day with a situation of constrained optimization when it comes to human relations. We are surrounded by people who often pursue different values than we do, based on different assumptions about the world. At the same time, we need to live in peace with those people. And if we want to live well, we need to find the good in them and the values that they can offer to enhance our lives. This is, I think, the true libertarian attitude, the true attitude of fostering tolerance and benevolence and peace with other human beings. And I think, in that respect, my attitude toward the ideas held by others is the diametrical opposite of Mr. Molyneux's. Rather than seeing any major disagreement as an exclusionary criterion, I see any bit of ground, any bit of common ground, any potential for interesting, meaningful discussion that promotes intellectual development and human cooperation as the inclusionary criterion for human association. It's what brings people into my circle, rather than disagreements with them keeping them out. Far from showing a lack of integrity, this fundamentally benevolent and cosmopolitan approach is the highest manifestation of human integrity. Surely, a philosophically educated human being is not going to be corrupted by associating and working with those who disagree with him, as long as he continues to promote his values and emphasize his principles in doing so. I think, in the same way, Mr. Molyneux would agree with me that just reading a text that espouses views contrary to one's own would not do intellectual damage to oneself. Indeed, if John Stuart Mill's arguments on liberty are to be accepted for this, it can only help, either if one is indeed wrong in showing where one is wrong, or if one is right and the text or the opposing argument is wrong, showing one how to argue better, how to identify the other side's errors and be more effective in responding to them. Interaction with other people to build on common values through trade, broadly defined, of course, including human relationships, emotional trade, is the best way to bring those values into greater prominence in the world. And furthermore, it surprises me that Mr. Molyneux has not acknowledged the effects of Ron Paul on individuals who are already fundamentalist Christians to begin with, but who are drawn by Dr. Paul toward greatly increased economic literacy and respect for individual freedom. I have met many such people as an atheist who attended a college where approximately 90% of the student body was deeply Christian, but about 50% of the student body had significant libertarian leanings, at the very least. That was Hillsdale College, a very unique place where I spent 4 years of my life. So I've had a lot of opportunities to interact with these people, and the more libertarian-oriented Christians do an excellent job in communicating with other Christians and inspiring them to shed the authoritarian and communitarian predilections of mainstream Christianity in favor of a more individual-centered, market-respecting, and religiously tolerant approach. This is something that is badly needed in mainstream Christianity, and I'm glad to see some Christians working to bring it about, because as an atheist, I'm perceived as an outsider by a lot of mainstream Christians, who I think would much, much sooner change their views on economics than they would change their views on religion or on metaphysics. Those latter views are much more fundamental to their sense of identity, and it takes a lot more work to change those than to convince them of the efficacy of free markets and limited government. Mr. Molyneux, I want to ask this question to you. Would you rather have more Christians be libertarians, or have the same number of Christians as today be the kinds of theoconservatives who would actively use governments at all levels to restrict your own liberties. I would rather have more Christians, indeed all Christians, be libertarians inspired by the example of Dr. Ron Paul, because it means whatever metaphysical errors I think they have, they're going to respect my right to live my life as I see fit. And I think that is the greatest, most significant criterion for human peaceful coexistence. I can respect them as individuals, even if I don't agree with them, if they can respect me in my right to live my life as I see fit. We must also not forget that the United States Constitution explicitly prohibits a religious test for political office, something that Mr. Molyneux, as an atheist, would probably agree with in principle, even if he disagrees with the concept of public office or with the Constitution altogether. This principle is vital because it illustrates and embodies the absolute barrier between government and religion that the American founders intended. And that surely can only be a positive for individual liberty. Government, according to the founders, has well-defined and enumerated political functions intended to safeguard the rights of all of its constituents, irrespective of their personal metaphysical beliefs. Religion, on the other hand, is an entirely private sphere of one's life, meaning that though it can certainly be discussed openly as part of an individual's freedom of speech, it should not be invoked in any rules that govern how individuals must relate to one another. And really, the province of government is precisely to create those mandatory rules that in a limited government position are rules that are needed to make sure that individuals behave peacefully toward one another, do not aggress against one another unjustly, do not defraud one another unjustly. But even if one is not a minarchist but is an anarchist, one could still recognize that religion has no role, no province in these mandatory rules. So the laws and the policies created by the government must be completely blind to religion, as should be the criteria for holding political office. And this blindness should go both ways, either with respect to using religion as an inclusive criterion or an exclusive criterion. When fundamentalist Christians, and unfortunately the majority of Americans who are influenced by the political culture that the fundamentalists created, insist that only a good Christian can be president of the United States, this is clearly a violation of the letter and spirit of the Constitution. But does not the same principle get violated just as much when it is insisted that a religious person cannot possibly be worthy of an atheist's political support, irrespective of what policies that individual advocates? Is that not the same religious test for office in reverse? If Ron Paul believes in a God, or is skeptical about evolution, we surely have the right to disagree, and I disagree thoroughly with these positions. I could discuss in great depth why I don't believe that a God exists, and why I think evolutionary theory is completely justified and indeed essential in explaining biology, and indeed relevant to social theory as well, to economics in the form of the Hayekian concept of spontaneous order. But as I explained in my video, Ron Paul's views on evolution are irrelevant. One could not possibly expect a waiter who serves one at a restaurant or a mechanic who fixes one's car to agree with one on metaphysical or scientific questions. Still, those people can be fine waiters and they can be excellent mechanics. The same would apply to one's president, as this position, if viewed in light of its proper constraints, as Ron Paul does see it, would have no bearing on metaphysical or scientific questions. Indeed, Ron Paul himself has stated numerous times that he considers these views of his to have nothing to do with the policies that he would pursue as president. These views should therefore have no influence on whether one favors or disfavors Ron Paul's campaign. If he himself says they're irrelevant, then they're irrelevant. That is a logical consequence of taking a person's arguments at their face value. Anything else is psychologizing and I think improper for strictly rational argumentation. Mr. Molyneux says that people might be turned off from libertarianism by thinking that libertarians love people who reject evolution, his words. Now, that's as much of a non sequitur as thinking that because Mr. Molyneux has so many views and downloads, libertarians must love people who wear gray t-shirts, as Mr. Molyneux did in that particular video and in several other of his videos. it is just not a position that follows from the content of what Mr. Molyneux is saying. Just as wearing a gray t-shirt has no bearing on libertarianism qua libertarianism, neither does one's stance on evolution. Now, that being said, I recognize that in many respects ideas are interrelated, and it does take a genuine intellectual radicalism to see those connections among ideas and to utilize them for the most powerful effect. However, the other side of that very coin is that most people would not perceive the connections, and so can be highly effective at compartmentalizing. Most people are not intellectual radicals, and that includes most libertarians. So they can very reasonably compartmentalize their belief in economic freedom from their views on evolutionary theory. Most people can and do indeed hold beliefs in one area of their lives that are not entirely consistent with their beliefs in other areas of their lives. But what should be important to us as rational advocates of liberty is what specific area are we interacting with those people in? If it is an area where their views and behaviors are essentially sound, then there is no reason to assume by default that their flaws in other areas must necessarily have seeped over into that area in question. I mean, if you encounter a fundamentalist Christian who is a great car mechanic, do you assume automatically that his fundamentalist Christianity somehow makes his approach to car repair less logical or less effective or more costly than it would be if he were an atheist or secular humanist or a libertarian, or whichever persuasion you favor, as opposed to a fundamentalist Christian? Of course not. And the same goes for a president who explicitly says that his views on evolution have no bearing on the policy that he would advocate. Besides, if someone makes as fundamental an error as thinking that libertarianism must have a necessary position on the theory of biological evolution, so as to say that libertarians love people who reject evolution, then surely this person already misunderstands libertarianism. This person already doesn't get what libertarianism is all about. Libertarianism is a political theory, not a biological one. And while evolutionary ideas, like that of the Hayekian spontaneous order, do enhance and enrich libertarian and Austrian economic analysis, even these more closely connected ideas are not a prerequisite for effective libertarian policy. One doesn't even have to be aware of these ideas in order to be a strict constitutionalist like Ron Paul, and therefore greatly scale back the scope and power of the federal government. Mr. Molyneux argues that essentially it's hard to say how many people have been turned off from libertarianism because of that, but in his words, it's certainly not inconsequential, and it's certainly worth asking. And I ask, first, why does Mr. Molyneux assume it is not inconsequential? Where is his evidence for that? And second, if any people are turned off, it may be because of propaganda from left liberal elites, which I have heard, who oppose Ron Paul. Now, Mr. Molyneux is certainly not a left liberal elite. He is far, far from that. But he may be seeing comments made by others in that regard, others who may respect science and may even be inclined toward atheism, but who are also inclined toward the political left. There are many such people in the United States. And these people's focus on Ron Paul's views on evolution may be what Mr. Molyneux is referring to here. I have encountered that in my own discussions, but if Mr. Molyneux is thinking about something else as the context for the statement that he made, he may certainly feel free to correct me. But I submit that this is not Ron Paul's doing. But if my characterization is correct, it's the doing of the left liberal elites who attempt to smear Ron Paul by overemphasizing his views on evolution and therefore turning people off from him who might otherwise have had a reason to prefer him over Obama, because Ron Paul is more consistent on certain socially liberal issues in conventional American parlance than Obama is, and Ron Paul is also more consistent on foreign policy than Obama is. So the left liberal elites who don't want that left liberal support for Ron Paul are trying their best to dissuade their constituents from shifting toward Ron Paul in place of Obama. So in that case, Ron Paul is certainly blameless. He should not be blamed for the smear tactics of his enemies. Indeed, if that is indeed a smear tactic, then it's illustrative of how successful Ron Paul has been, that his opponents feel the need to resort to that kind of mischaracterization and overemphasis of his views on evolution. Now, to be very fair to Mr. Molyneux, as has been my intent throughout this presentation, he acknowledges that he himself does not hate or does not oppose Ron Paul as an individual, that he might have pleasant interactions with him if such interactions ever occurred. And I think this is very admirable and important to emphasize. In my response to Mr. Molyneux, I think it is vital not to overlook this, and also to underscore that this is a respectful disagreement with Mr. Molyneux, and in itself it is also by no means intended to invoke hostility. Rather, it is a means of pursuing the truth and achieving the most effective real-world change possible through discussion and mutual understanding and refinement of ideas on all sides. That being said, I'd like to delve into what Mr. Molyneux considers to be alternative approaches to political action. He focuses on two. The first one is what he calls ostracism of statists, and the second one is the prevention of child abuse and improved and peaceful parenting. On improved parenting and prevention of child abuse, I agree entirely, 100%. There's no dispute whatsoever that I think a reasonable person should have with Mr. Molyneux on this. And I think emphasis on this dimension has been one of Mr. Molyneux's greatest contributions to freedom-oriented philosophy. If you value the rights of human beings, children are human beings too. They have rights too. They have rational capacity as well. And I wish Mr. Molyneux the very best in his success in this goal. I think the current society throughout the United States and the Western world in general, and throughout human history, has greatly undervalued children and has done a miserable job in protecting their rights. I think an aspect of libertarian philosophy that emphasizes peaceful parenting and prevention of abuse by parents who do not perform their proper roles, and also by bullies, is a great, great addition to libertarian thinking. However, on his other suggested approach, the ostracism of statists, I consider this counterproductive for several reasons. First, you will not persuade anyone through ostracism. At best, they will ignore you like you ignore them. At worst, they will be antagonized by the ostracism and will only retrench in their flawed views. Reaching out to people and attempting to communicate civilly, listening to their ideas and their concerns, as well as expressing one's own, that is the only way to change minds. Not ostracism. Just as militant atheism will not work to change the minds of religious individuals, neither will militant or disdainful or hostile anarchism change the minds of those who advocate for more federal power. In general, you change minds by breaking stereotypes, not by reinforcing them. You break stereotypes by showing people that you are not really what their previous propaganda tried to convince them you were, that you're indeed different, that you're a decent person, that you don't have some insidious design on whatever it is that they value, and that you can listen to what it is that they value, listen to what they perceive to be the problems in the world, and respond to that directly, not just have a prepackaged ideology that you're trying to sell them. That's the most effective way to get across to people, and it happens through, I don't like using this word, but I think it's fitting in this case, a kind of organic interaction that can be embedded in the context of everyday life. And my second objection to the ostracism of statists is that the term statist itself is far too vague and potentially too broad to be useful in these kinds of discussions. Now, I know a little bit about the history of the term. It originates from the French étatisme, meaning, in that context, the total control of the state, by which is meant the governmental entity where the political power is vested, not one of the US 50 states, but rather the central locus of power over an individual citizen. That is what étatisme means in its original context. And I can't help but be reminded by this expression of Louis XIV's famous quote, "L'État c'est moi," or "I am the state." For me, that term elicits a strong association with Louis XIV's self-aggrandizing authoritarianism, as well as the mercantilist protectionism of his finance minister, Jean-Baptiste Colbert. Yet, of course, in common usage, the term's applicability extends far beyond this. It may be legitimate to use this term to refer to people who actively advocate for expanded government power relative to the status quo, or who believe that it is the proper role of government to plan and direct most aspects of individuals' lives, as it did in France under Louis XIV, where it even prescribed how many pieces of thread must be in an individual piece of cloth. It was really bizarre how micro-regulated that society was. But I fear that a lot of people in the anarcho-capitalist camp have begun using this term to refer to anyone who believes in any role for government at all, which is the overwhelming majority of people, even those who would sharply reduce the role of government. I don't think it's appropriate to refer to those people as statists, but we have the ludicrous spectacle now of minarchists being considered statists. Of course, this does not harm minarchists, like me, nearly as much as it would harm the anarcho-capitalists who invoke such mischaracterizations, because all those people do is wall themselves off from the rest of human society, crippling their ability to cooperate with others and enact any meaningful positive change. This is analogous to vegans refusing to have anything to do with anyone who is not a vegan, including vegetarians, and calling those people slaughterists. Imagine a vegetarian being considered a slaughterist by a vegan. That's how it feels for a minarchist to be called a statist by an anarchist. It's just as ridiculous. And Mr. Molyneux, to his credit, is probably too sophisticated a thinker to lapse into that particular fallacy. But I have met other anarcho-capitalists who are not so refined. They, I think, would readily latch onto Mr. Molyneux's recommendation to, quote, ostracize statists, and use it as a license to cut off any meaningful, non-hostile interaction with libertarians who disagree with them on the proper scope of government, if any, or even with other anarcho-capitalists with whom they have methodological or goal-related differences. Unfortunately, this tendency is bolstered, I think, when Mr. Molyneux uses terms like minimal statism to describe minarchism, therefore rendering himself open to being misunderstood, certainly, but cited as support by the militantly hostile anarchist types. And third, by ostracizing people, one does not change the fact that the political system remains fraught with catastrophic problems. Ostracism does nothing to solve those problems or to prevent unjustified intervention in one's own life. Just as an example, millions of Americans today are being groped and virtually strip-searched in airports, and how does ostracism solve that problem? Surely one can refuse to fly, as I have, in an effort to preserve one's dignity. But that's not ostracism, that's more like self-protection. How does one end the abusive policies altogether? If you are at the airport already, ostracizing the TSA agents will certainly not help. It'll only get you in trouble. The only way to end this abuse is to influence, or better yet, replace those who had the political power to make the decisions that brought this abuse about in the first place. But replacing those people, or I guess in a more naively optimistic sense, trying to persuade them to act differently and reverse those actions, that requires political involvement. That requires political activism. This is one of my great hopes for Ron Paul, that he will stop groping at the airports. Mr. Molyneux argues that, well, classical liberalism has been around for about 150 years or so, and it has consistently tried to use political power, and he essentially asks, well, where has that gotten us? But Mr. Molyneux himself says later on that it takes about 150 years for ideas to come into full bloom when influencing society. And he discusses extensively the anti-slavery idea as an example of how this occurred. Well, perhaps we are just now on the cusp of the success of the classical liberal idea, using Mr. Molyneux's own argument. Let us not discard this forthcoming success, or at least the hope of such success, due to our disappointment with the results so far. The anti-slavery movement had to be persistent, too, through periods of time when the prevalence of slavery was actually on the rise, as it was in the American South during the early 19th century. They had to be persistent through great antagonism and rejection by the dominant societal attitudes of their time, but they succeeded because they saw this through. So let us be persistent. Let us see this through. The Ron Paul campaign offers an excellent, outstanding opportunity for us to do just that. Mr. Molyneux says, It's the opportunity cost of political action that bothers him. And I respond that the opportunity cost is not high if the political action is simultaneously accompanied by other goods, such as economic or philosophical education, which can be achieved simultaneously, as well as building strong relationships with others who advocate liberty and are also involved in the political effort. The approach of improving personal relationships is advocated by Mr. Molyneux, which is, I think, a very productive approach, can be pursued simultaneously with the political approach if, and this is a big if, one favors the right candidate. Note that I am not recommending support for half-hearted, established, so-called pragmatic, lesser of two evils candidates, because that would indeed be a great sacrifice of opportunity to little benefit. I only recommend this approach with truly principled candidates like Ron Paul. It is precisely the rare, fortuitous concatenation of principle and political momentum that leads me to advocate intense political activity on Ron Paul's behalf today. And I advocate this knowing that the opportunity benefits of doing so, the possible payoff, by no means a guaranteed one, but the possible payoff of liberty very soon in our lifetimes would be tremendous. This is a precious and rare opportunity, and we should make the most of it in every dimension. After this election, if people like Mr. Molyneux are correct, or even if the mainstream media is correct in predicting that Ron Paul won't win, we'll just be back to where we started, and we will have plenty of time to pursue all the other strategies if this one doesn't work out. But let's give this one a try now and see what happens, empirically, rather than discount it at the onset. Mr. Molyneux says that you and I cannot get Ron Paul elected, or make Ron Paul do the right thing if he is elected. And I reply that sure, I cannot on my own, and Mr. Molyneux cannot on his own, but enough of us certainly can. That is the US electoral system, and the unfortunate prisoner's dilemma that it puts us in if we each think only of our direct influence at the ballot box. But if we attempt to broaden that influence by reaching out to people through persuasion, rational argumentation, and prudent activism, then we can break out of that prisoner's dilemma. That is why I'm making this video, and that is why I plan to do much more than cast my vote for Ron Paul as a way of supporting him. In particular, in sharing my reasoning with you, I hope to convince you that we are not each hopelessly alone in supporting the cause of liberty. This is the kind of relationship of mutual understanding and intellectual growth that I hope to establish with my viewers in making these commentaries. Mr. Molyneux argues that he has a tough time with religiosity, especially fundamentalist religiosity, when it comes to the protection of children. And granted, the Bible is a terrible instruction manual for raising children. Phrases like "spare the rod, spoil the child" unfortunately continue to have a pernicious influence in many families today. Physical abuse and violence toward children are practices that I find completely inexcusable. They need to be rooted out of all civilized society. But fortunately for us, most Christians, even most fundamentalist ones today, are far more moral than their own holy book. The best way to gauge an individual's approach toward parenting is how that individual raises his or her own children, I think. Ron Paul did not raise his children in an abusive fashion, and we can see that each of them has become successful, fulfilled people with positive influences on the world. Think as a great example of his son, Dr. Rand Paul, who has followed in his footsteps, and who clearly greatly admires and respects his father, as do all of Dr. Paul's other children. So clearly, Ron Paul did something right as a parent. And all the empirical evidence is against any insinuation that Ron Paul would sacrifice the welfare of children to the literal teachings of the Bible. I do agree with Mr. Molyneux that people who are power-hungry probably had abused childhoods, and I acknowledge that he excludes Ron Paul from that designation because he acknowledges that Ron Paul isn't power-hungry, he just wants to change the system for the better. So it seems that there's enough room on that point for Mr. Molyneux to agree with me that while religious literalism in general does not encourage the sound upbringing of children if you cleave to the holy texts, religious individuals nonetheless can, and in many cases do, raise their children well, despite such teachings, because these are still human beings, and these are still individuals who are motivated by basic human kindness and by common sense and by basic morality, which I think has thrived in the world, despite absurdities like spare the rod, spoil the child. Mr. Molyneux's big argument against minarchism, or what he calls minimal statism, is that minimal states result in more economic freedom, which results in economic growth, which results in larger, more intrusive government. And the more minimal the government is to begin with, the faster we get to a more intrusive government because of faster economic growth. I have a three-pronged response to that. First of all, if that's the case, what is the solution? Is it to keep governments more intrusive today so that we do not have more intrusive government? That, of course, is self-defeating. We are already at the endpoint of Mr. Molyneux's posited progression or retrogression of a free society. A more free society will only hit the reset button on that retrogression, giving us precious time to advance technologically and culturally. So even if he's right, we're already at the endpoint of that progression, so why not reset it? Second, even if Mr. Molyneux's causal analysis is correct, in the interim, when we push that reset button, we have much more freedom. That interim, ladies and gentlemen, is called our lives. Ultimately, unless one can live in a free society, the idea of liberty is nothing more than a dream or a pleasant abstraction with no real-world relevance. I am not satisfied with it being merely a pleasant abstraction or a philosophically correct path that will nonetheless never be realized for me. I want liberty, as much of it as possible, in my own lifetime. The sooner the better. I am not willing to wait for 2 or 3 or 10 generations to pass before liberty becomes the norm. This is why I support Ron Paul and any other approaches that have momentum behind them, enough momentum to make a dent in the status quo and move us, if only incrementally, toward greater freedom. Third, technology can short-circuit the growth of government power by liberating individuals and hyper-empowering them. The internet, in particular, has done this recently, as I have illustrated in my 2008 paper, Liberation by Internet, How Technology Destroys Tyranny. And what's really satisfying for me about that paper is I wrote that paper before WikiLeaks became prominent on the public stage. I wrote that paper before the Arab Spring, which was largely made possible due to the spread of information via the internet and the coordination of the various protests against authoritarian regimes in the Middle East. So I feel very vindicated 3 years later that indeed the internet and technology in general can destroy tyranny and will continue to do so. But even more so, biotechnology and, in the future, nanotechnology and home-based manufacturing, tabletop manufacturing, can do even more to achieve the spread of liberty and short-circuit that tendency toward more oppressive political power that Mr. Molyneux mentions. I am a transhumanist, and ultimately for me, the greatest benefit of liberty is the technological innovation that it facilitates. I value liberty as the highest political goal, but not as the highest goal altogether. Politics is the means to the goal of improving individual lives. The most significant improvements to individual life come from beating back the forces of death and decay and helping humanity grow beyond its limitations of the ridiculously fragile and vulnerable condition in which biological evolution has left us. Even 30 or 50 years of liberty, much less time than it took the US to degenerate from the ethos of the founding to what we have today, will be enough to unleash the massive technological advances that will enable us to achieve indefinite longevity and assure the survival of the human species through the colonization of space. Once these breakthroughs take place, there will be no turning back toward the obsolete and oppressive political orders of the past. We might still have government, probably a much more minimal government that is within the minarchist mold, but the power of the individual will no longer be so puny as to be capable of being subordinated by demagogues, dictators, and tribalistic collectivistic groupthink. Economic growth will no longer be accompanied by the growth of institutionalized parasitism, since technology will remove people's constraints to achieving their happiness directly, as opposed to through restrictions by others. If only the current political system becomes sufficiently free to allow future technologies to be developed. That technology in itself will change people's minds so as to achieve a lasting victory for liberty. And this argument essentially implies that we are in a kind of home stretch, a race between the power of technology and the power of command and control. And whoever can make even incremental strides ahead in that race will ultimately determine the future of humanity. This is why I think the stakes could not be higher. And this is why I think political action today in favor of someone who is truly as principled as Dr. Ron Paul is vital. Now, I do not think, from all the evidence that I have, that Mr. Molyneux is himself a transhumanist, at least not according to my understanding of his comments on death, which I have seen in several of his previous videos and heard in several of his previous broadcasts. But for me, as a transhumanist, of all the presidential candidates today, I see Ron Paul as the most likely to allow complete free rein to private technological research and invention of the sort that would happen on its own in the absence of deliberate federal government constraints. Since he, as a strict constitutionalist, considers the federal government to have no constitutional authority to intervene with such research, his administration will, by its inaction, offer the innovators in emerging technologies the time and breathing room they need to roll out their life-saving inventions. Imagine 8 years, if Ron Paul gets 2 terms, of light or no federal intervention in drug research, or the development of other medical procedures, or research in nanotechnology. Imagine what strides will be made during that time. That might be the boost that the power of technology needs in the race against the power of command and control. Mr. Molyneux argues that Ron Paul, when elected, if he's elected, is going to have to advocate, quote, sacrifice, paying more to the government than getting out from the government and services in order for the deficit of the federal government to be solved. But Mr. Molyneux says that's not how Ron Paul has worked with his constituents in the past. My response is it really a sacrifice if the services that are cut are intrusions on individuals' liberty, such as the sinkholes of money that are the U.S. foreign occupations and wars, the outrageously abusive security state that has been established at home, or the brutal and completely useless war on drugs that has sacrificed so many innocent people. Billions upon billions of dollars are spent on these completely counterproductive programs. And those can certainly be cut right away. Enough can be cut without the sacrifices that Mr. Molyneux refers to being felt by most people, except the ones who actually benefit from the institutionalized predation of the drug war. Furthermore, Ron Paul can and does emphasize the secondary consequences of the cuts, which will be economic growth and more liberty for everyone. So that might imply a long-term benefit for the very people who may even suffer from some immediate deprivation if you cut this federal program or that federal program. Certainly, that's an aspect of it that should be emphasized. And if he's elected, Ron Paul should take care to integrate that in his rhetoric, but I think he's already most of the way there. Mr. Molyneux says, quote, "I don't think there's a savior out there," and I agree with him. Freedom will not be saved by one person. It will be saved by all of us. But one person can be an example to the rest of us, inspiring us to take our own actions, and educating us in the value and the workings of liberty. Ron Paul cannot succeed without us. So in a way, we can all be the saviors of freedom, especially if we do help this upsurge of momentum that is his presidential campaign. We can be the saviors of freedom, or it will not be saved. If we defer that task to another generation, it will not be saved, because the next generation will do just the same. Mr. Molyneux says that it takes about 100 to 150 years before a revolution of ideas is even possible, and that is from the time that the ideas first emerge. And his argument is we are not there yet. We are not ready yet. But, again, if classical liberalism has already had 150 years since its founding, and actually it's probably quite a bit more if you look at thinkers like Thomas Jefferson or even Bastiat, who wrote his major works about 165 years ago, then we are probably on the cusp already. That time period has already elapsed. The recent technological revolutions are helping, and indeed, it is a brilliant feedback loop. Political freedom bringing about more technology, which in turn will bring about more political freedom, as it started to do in the Middle East through the internet and through mobile devices. Mr. Molyneux suggests in the latter part of his video that we are only a few decades into the libertarian revolution, despite suggesting earlier that classical liberalism has had 150 years already. I suggest that he cannot have it both ways. He cannot say with respect to the disappointments of classical liberalism that it has had 150 years, but that with respect to its successes and growth, it has only had 40 years. He can adopt one view or the other view, based on his understanding of the facts of history and of how libertarianism and classical liberalism have evolved. And certainly I am open to the facts ruling one way or the other. But he should adopt that view consistently, whether or not it helps his case against political action. This appears to be a contradiction in his position, and a factual contradiction, as opposed to just one of his moral position. I would be tremendously interested in his response to this, because I do think it is crucial to the discussion here. But even if we were not on the cusp of freedom, based on Mr. Molyneux's estimate of 40 years or so of libertarian growth so far, I still want liberty in my lifetime. So I will try to get it using realistic, peaceful methods that have a chance of succeeding, or at least influencing the political landscape. And surely this campaign is not 100% guaranteed to be successful. I don't think anyone seriously believes that there's a guarantee that Ron Paul will be elected president and enact pro-freedom policies. However, I think the probability is not negligible. And furthermore, I am not willing to wait another 110 years for education about liberty to finally work its way into public opinion. Because waiting that long might mean that, in the meantime, the political climate remains hostile to rapid technological progress. And so I will not benefit from life extension, and I will not live for another 110 years, so I will not see the benefit of liberty. And again, if I can't get it in my lifetime, it just remains a pleasant philosophical abstraction. It would be very difficult to convince me to work for something that I would not live to see the fruits of. So I want liberty, though, and I think that more pessimistic approach ought to be rejected by us, because our efforts in events like this, the Ron Paul campaign, can truly make a difference and can truly get us to a stage where we do have liberty. Mr. Molyneux says that we libertarians have very simple arguments, for instance, the non-aggression principle. But generally, that argument is only accepted by non-libertarians in private relationships, not in the public sphere. And he asks the question, why aren't these principles accepted universally and applied universally? His theory on this is it's an emotional thing. It's an emotional aversion that people have to the non-aggression principle in politics. I think perhaps people need to improve in terms of their technological and biological opportunities before they can accept the non-aggression argument in the public sphere in mass. So while people feel vulnerable and deprived, as they are today with their pathetically vulnerable organisms, they seek a benevolent paternal figure to take care of them and their vulnerabilities. When they are sick, frail, and poor, they often see the government as such a benevolent figure, hence their insistence on a whole host of welfare programs, or, quote, security programs to protect them against alleged chimerical threats. Or else, if they don't see a governmental entity in that paternal role, they see God in that paternal role. Both are surrogates, I think, for the roles that parents would have for these people when they were children. But I do think that with technology empowering these people to withstand a lot of these perils on their own, they will not need those surrogates anymore. Now, the question is, of course, we don't have that kind of technology today, but we can set up a political system that encourages that technology to develop by not interfering negatively with it. That, I think, is what a Ron Paul administration would do. And that would set the stage for that technology coming about and getting people out of that psychological state of dependency. Mr. Molyneux's final argument is what would happen if Ron Paul were to achieve the presidency. And he compares that to what happened with Scott Walker, the governor of Wisconsin, who tried to do some very mild things to limit collective bargaining power among public employees. Mr. Molyneux suggests that there would be chaos, and the libertarian administration of Ron Paul would be blamed for that chaos. He says there will be riots, tear gas, bloodshed, strikes, and I think it really would depend on the order in which Ron Paul implements his reforms. Certainly, I can't rule out that outcome a priori. It's not completely impossible, but I think it's unlikely with Ron Paul. Like a surgeon, a pro-liberty reformer cannot take any steps in any order. There has to be a logical sequence of steps, guided by prudence and by principle, in order for the life of the patient to be saved. And the same applies to the freedom of a society. In order to save the freedom of a society, it's not enough to just consider freedom to be a good thing. For instance, I think a good first step would be to end the wars at home and abroad. That includes the foreign occupations and the war on drugs and the war on terror, which has the potential to provide for an indefinite expansion of the abusive security apparatus. That would not result in strikes, riots, or bloodshed. People would be happy to have those burdens lifted from them. Furthermore, ending corporate subsidies, or at least scaling back the abuses of the intellectual property system that prevent a lot of innovation today, would be a good next step in diminishing the people's need for the band-aid secondary interventions like welfare, Social Security, Medicare, and Medicaid, which really arise as a result of the primary interventions of the corporatist welfare state, the situation where the federal government massively favors established financial institutions or other established large companies at the expense of consumers and smaller businesses. And then consumers and smaller businesses are impoverished, and so they build up a political constituency for the band-aid measures like welfare and Social Security, since the corporatist elite has stolen from them all the other ways that they could have used to accumulate wealth. But the band-aid interventions can themselves be phased out gradually as well, while the existing beneficiaries can continue to accrue the full benefits of those programs, so as not to antagonize them and to fulfill the obligations that the federal government has promised to them. But the young and the currently employed could have a choice of opting out of the system. This, of course, is a highly skeletal series of proposals for what can be done in a sequential fashion to diminish the power of the federal government. And of course, Ron Paul justifiably might pursue a different series of steps. But one thing is certain. As a doctor, Ron Paul knows that just wanting the health of the patient is not enough. One also has to know extensively the intricate procedures that can bring about such health. And Ron Paul has many decades of economic education that surely qualify as such knowledge. And of course, that same principle applies to liberty. Dr. Paul, during his tenure in Congress, has crafted numerous ingenious bills designed to move us incrementally toward freedom in just one respect, and one respect that might be so small that the political establishment might not even think twice about it. And certainly these incremental bills would not bring about the same kind of deprivation and outrage that, in Mr. Molyneux's words, would result in strikes and bloodshed. Dr. Paul's bills are always crafted in such a way as to maximize individual citizens' economic opportunities in a prominent and visible way to them, and that's a good indicator of how he will behave in office. Who better than a doctor to understand the need for a methodical, sequential, and well-thought-out progression toward liberty? So I hope that my commentary here has been able to accomplish what Dr. Bloch has not, in actually constructively responding to Mr. Molyneux's criticisms and hopefully convincing you that those criticisms are not enough to withhold one's support from Dr. Ron Paul. My greatest hope for this discussion is that it will continue to elicit considerable conversation among libertarians and non-libertarians, and to bring some libertarians at least closer to being comfortable with Dr. Ron Paul's campaign. And of course, I would be quite honored if Mr. Molyneux were to provide his reply, even if it were in the form of a complete rebuttal to my arguments. I would be very interested, now that a thorough response to his arguments in particular have been offered, what he would think of that, how he would reply, and furthermore, whether I've changed his mind on anything, or whether he continues to hold to his present views. Thank you very much. I hope you found this enjoyable and interesting, and I look forward to your comments.